Hello, welcome once again to the Enchanted Kingdom of Hermione. I'm up here in the Turret of Pleasure, ruminating about various things. Um, Thinking about important dates for some reason. Important dates in music history. And I got thinking, especially the history of the LP. The LP record was really the thing that was the format that conveyed a lot of musical energy from, from the early 50s until even today, up until the 90s, it was the dominant format of delivering high quality music to consumers. And I got thinking about, what are important records in the history of the LP record? And then I got more specifically, I thought, what records impacted the industry the most? So I came up with a list of 12 records because I couldn't come up with 10. And maybe more even. How many? Yeah, maybe. That changed the way the music business operated. Sometimes in subtle ways, sometimes in major ways. Figured I'd do it chronologically. The first one's pretty obvious. September 1948, Columbia Masterworks puts out the first LP record. ML 4001, if you need to know the serial number. And it was Mendelssohn Violin Concerto performed by Nathan Milstein with Bruno Walter conducting. And it was one of those Columbia record LPs. You've seen them in every thrift store. It's like a color with a Roman column, kind of white Roman column on it. And Columbia Masterworks presents. And they made a whole bunch of these at the dawn of the LP era. They all had the blue Columbia label. They were, for the most part, pretty much all crap. I mean, I know I've had this record. I'm sure of it. Sure, I had this record in my collection. I do believe I've thrown them all out. All the original Masterworks. They were really poor surfaces. They hadn't figured out the idea of spacing grooves yet. The sound is terrible. And the graphics are terrible. However, number one, that was the first one. And of course it was classical, because back then classical was still kind of king. 1948, boy. Anyway, the LP came along, and the record companies, now the LP came about as a result of the War of the Speeds, as they call it. Columbia wanted to do a 12-inch 33 RPM record to have more length than a 78, which was about 3 minutes. RCA, of course, because they didn't want to march in step with CBS, they made these 7-inch 45 with the big hole. Everything about it different, naturally. And those were, they said, well, you can put them on changers, and their argument was lame. They were basically better sounding 78s. And the market sort of told them that as well. And so RCA finally threw in the towel. They started making LPs pretty quick. I forget when they started, but what ended up happening was that the 7 inches ended up being the single song format, and it ended up being 45 RPM. And so they kind of came in second, but it was still a format that got used extensively for the next, still gets used. So it was kind of weird. So the LP at first, and most of these things I'm going to talk about are pop music. There wasn't a whole lot of, other than that first one, there wasn't a lot of innovative classical records per se. I mean, I could nitpick and call a few out. But the first LP, 5 years into the format, first LP to really make a difference in the way the industry worked was, of course, in March 1956, Elvis Presley's first album. It came out, it went to the top of the charts, which was the first time any kind of rock record album had done that. Albums were still not really for pop music. Pop music was the domain of young people, cheap. They didn't have money. And so this was the first big rock record. And this showed the record companies, RCA, of course, it was on RCA, who, of course, didn't invent the LP. And so they embraced the LP, and by the time they got into step with the rest of the industry, they put this record out, and it just blew the doors open. Nothing would ever be the same again in the record industry. Pop artists suddenly making an album with a pop artist made sense. It would make money, and it was the first big rock record. So I put that in there as number 2. Number 3, November 1957. This is a weird one. It doesn't really. It had a title. I can't remember what it was, but it's an Audio Fidelity, the label, who are a weird label. They would do sound effect records, millions of sound effect records, and they would do their whole thing was hi-fi, back when the term hi-fi barely was even understood. And they, AFLP 1872, they put out a stereo test demonstration album available to the public, and side 1 was, I think they were following a Dixieland band around town. Side 2 was something like a train, or I don't know, day in the country. It was just like a field recording, but in stereo. This is important, number 3, because it was the first domestically issued stereophonic LP, which would very quickly become the standard for anything that required sound quality. It took longer to take hold completely in the pop music world, but November 57th, first stereo record comes out. And so you have a kind of the format settles in. This is 10 years in. The 7 inches are used for singles. They're almost always in monophonic. I don't think there was a stereo single put out for a while. The LP-sized records were mostly used for things that required longer periods of time, i.e. classical music, jazz records. Jazz players could now stretch out a bit. And occasionally you would get pop, probably more like anthologies. As often as not, those would be in mono. But as stereo kind of became the standard, most of the major record labels started issuing their classical catalog in stereo. And in many cases, they put them out in both stereo and mono, which caused, as you can imagine, caused a real headache in the warehouse. So, you know, in the early era there, it was ML whatever, 4011 was the mono version, and MS was the stereo version. You'd put them in separate parts of the warehouse. You know, this kind of was a headache, but there you go. Around 1966 or 7 maybe, Clive Davis had taken over basically as the head guy of Columbia Records. He'd started as a lawyer, of course, ended up being the head guy. And one of the things he noticed was that the warehouses were separated into mono and stereo, and he was like, well, this is ridiculous. He goes, and so he gets his technical people, and he goes, now, can I play a stereo record on a mono record player? And they go, yeah, sure, just make sure it's a diamond stylus, you know, not a crap stylus. Don't play it with a 78 stylus. All right, other than that, it's perfectly compatible. Oh, yeah, just folds down. He goes, why are we making mono records? So with the stroke of a pen, he pretty much eliminated mono records in CBS, at CBS. And as a result, pretty much everybody followed suit overnight. And pretty much that was it for mono. That was by about 1968. Mono had a pretty good run, 20 years. But by 1968, stereo was common, if not all the time. A lot of pop music still was in mono. But in the rock revolution really took off. The Beatles took off. The Beach Boys, you know, and Bob Dylan. And Bob Dylan was very influential, much more than his sales would warrant. And Bob Dylan did something in June 1966 that was pretty darn near unprecedented in pop music up to that point. But the minute he did it, pretty much everybody started doing it, and that is he put out a double album. And that was Blonde on Blonde. And Blonde on Blonde had the unmitigated audacity to feature a song that took up a whole side of a record. Now, it was a 12-minute side. It was pretty it was pretty short. But just it was so cool. And especially because Dylan, conveyed special cachet in the rock crowd. He was just a little bit cooler than the Beach Boys or the Beatles or whomever. And literally, the first... I looked this up, and there's going to be people go, wait a minute, I thought Freak Out. Freak Out came out the month after, apparently. According to Wiki and all the other places. June 66 for Blonde on Blonde, July 66 for Freak Out. But after that, it just took off like crazy. And so that one really changed the way the industry worked. Bands started demanding to be able to do double albums to express themselves. Hell, the Hampton Grease Band got one. Who knew? Worst selling record in CBS history, I do believe. May 67 brings us to, hey, some of these records are just so amazing because they're groundbreaking. And Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band is really important for a million reasons, really. But really, as far as a couple of specific things, the Beatles were the largest, the biggest, the most popular band in the world, and they were at the absolute peak of their popularity. And to this point, they had been treated rather shabbily by their record label, both in the UK and especially in the US. And I'm not going to go too far into this, but in the US, Dave Dexter Jr., who was in charge of their file, if you will, would cut songs off of records and remix them and compile them into albums that didn't exist in the UK. And basically, because they had to pay a tiny bit more publishing, because they paid by the song, whereas in England it was different, they wanted songs with only 12 albums with only 12 songs on them. And in Britain, they normally had 14. So he figured out that he could prune songs off and give the Canadian or the American consumer and Canadian consumer, because we suffered with these things, he could give us a 10-song album, pocket 4 songs, and then 4 months later put out another 10-song album, pocket 4 more songs, and then 4 months later put out another 10-song album, and then 4 months after that put out an album of all the songs he pocketed. This didn't work very well thematically for the albums. Some of us are scarred to this day. I still hear Revolver, and it's like, it's all wrong because I grew up with the American version, which is an abomination, I might add, to what, the original album was. So, Sgt. Pepper's, at the end of, I think after Revolver, their contract came up with EMI, who was just absolutely desperate to renew it, because why wouldn't you? And so the Beatles said, oh, okay, from now on, that fool in America is not going to monkey with our bloody records. And almost immediately, Dexter was gone. Actually, I think he was gone just before this happened, but after a while, they were like, we hate what he's doing, stop it. So that was in their contract. You get the record the way we send it to you. What this meant was that they had creative control over their output in all their territories. And it was the moment of real empowerment to the pop bands over their labels. So they could say, listen, from this point on, you just get what we send you. We don't care if you don't like the cover. We don't care if you don't like one song on it. We don't care. You're going to get it the way we send it. And so that's why I think it's so important that it was, a groundbreaking record, sold trillions of copies, and many people think it's their best record. That's all kind of beside the point. This was the moment. This album was the first pop album where the band really called all the shots. And something that happened a lot more. Starting now, a lot of bands did this. Big bands, the Stones, bands like Crosby, Stills, and Nash, they really did this a lot. Okay, I'm going to move on. March 1970, here is one that I guarantee you've never heard of. I haven't even looked it up on YouTube to see if it's there to listen to it, because I don't know hardly anything about this. But in March 1970, a fellow by the name of Buddy Fight, FITE, put out a record on Ampex, and there are little labels done by Ampex. But this is noteworthy. I can't remember the name of the song. Anyway, I think it's on this. I wrote it down here somewhere. Glad Rag something. Anyway, it's the first 12-inch single. And it was done initially, a bunch of labels tried to do 12-inch singles. They used them mostly as promotional things. Finally, a guy named Tom Muldoon, I can't remember how to pronounce his name now. He discovered that if you cut records with very short durations at 45 RPM, and you had like a 4-minute song for the whole slab of wax, well, you could get ridiculously high amplitudes out of everything, including, the bass especially. And so these became very popular when disco hit. And 12-inch culture became a thing all by itself. DJs would make their own acetates to play in discotheques, and a lot of 12-inch culture reached into things like punk rock and even classical. I've even got a version of Ravel's Bolero, but it's on a Deutsche Grammophon 12-inch, they don't actually, I don't think they say it's a dance mix, but it's like a 12-inch single at 45 RPM. And I think this was when it was in a famous movie. I can't remember which movie. 10 maybe? At any rate, the 12-inch single was pretty much born March 1970 by Buddy Fight. I looked it up. I don't know what it sounds like. Light jazz. Jazz rock, apparently, is what it was described as. But I was looking for categories to fill here, and I thought, oh yeah, 12-inch single, that's a whole separate culture. Which it was. May 1970. A few months later was the release of the sound. 8 months after the fact, or 9 months after the fact, was the release of the soundtrack to the movie Woodstock, which of course was the soundtrack to the rock festival Woodstock as well. And this record is important in one major way, and that's that it was the first rock record to be a triple album. Now, people go, so, whatever. But it had never happened before. And a triple record was, a lot of people, it might have been a step too far, because the list was like $12 instead of like $6. And, back in those days, that was a lot of money. And, you've got a whole mixed bag of artists on it, so what if you only like one of the artists? Now, the good news is, of course, that the movie was very popular, and some of the performances on it are, almost career-defining. I mean, the Santana performance is amazing. The Sly performance is amazing. And there's artists on there, Sha-Na-Na, but it sold really well. And the other interesting thing, and this is for us label nerds, is that Atlantic Records got the rights to put the record out, even though they only had one band on the bill, which was Crosby, Stills, and Nash. Everybody else, they had to clear with licensing and whatnot, which must have been a real headache. And then when they got the whole caboodle together and ready to put out, and for reasons I will never really figure out, and if you know why they did this, I demand the comments. But they put it on the Cotillion label, which was sort of the redheaded stepchild label of the Atlantic Group. You had Atlantic, you had Atco, which was now kind of the white hard rock label. And then you had Cotillion, which has started out as a gospel label, kind of soul. And then suddenly it was Woodstock and McDonald and Giles and Troika from Edmonton and all these weird white hard rock bands. And it kind of sputtered along as this kind of almost like the third-rate label, if you will. Emerson, Lake and Palmer were on it. And then it kind of faded away, and then it came back in the 80s, I guess, as a sort of a soul label, a black label, different label and everything. Denise Williams, I think, was on it, and Sister Sledge was on it, and I don't know. But I never really figured out why it existed. It was strange. Anyway, Woodstock, there you go. Now, this one's hard to peg, so I just put in 1973. But one thing, and this didn't really change the industry that much, but what they call multi-sided records. I call them multi-cut. Multi-sided records, these are when you put the needle in the groove and you play the record and then you do it again, something different comes out. Apparently, these are as old as the hills. I looked this up. They were back in the 78 days they had these. And they were, they don't really occur in the history of the LP record much. And I can't really say that they influenced, well, they did influence the LP record in that you had to learn how to cut these things. And apparently these things are not easy to cut. And once cut, then you can press them just like other records, which is fine. But the most famous of these, and it's mentioned again in the wiki article, and this is 1973, was the Monty Python Matching Tie and Handkerchief, where one of the two side twos, because they're both labeled side two, actually plays different both times if you go through it twice. Which, I'll tell you what, this was the first time most people discovered this technique. And I'll tell you what, it baffled a lot of people for a little while. This was one of the great pranks that the record business played on its customers. The other being the extra track at the end of the CD, which, after a 25-minute pause. I think Nirvana were the first to do that. And we'll get back to them. At any rate, yeah, so Monty Python, the double grooved record. Now, this got utilized in a lot of weird ways. I just found out there's a John Cooper Clarke single that I don't have, that I want, that's double cut. I once had, and it even got into popular culture, I had a game, I cannot remember the name of the game, but it was a music biz game. And it was all about succeeding in the music business. God, I wish I still had it. But it did not use dice. Instead, it had a triple cut single, 7-inch single. And you put the needle down and it would go one of three things. It's a hit, it's a hit, it's a hit. Or, it's a flop, wah, wah. Or, break even, break even, And that was how you were supposed to, that was how you're supposed to make decisions in this game. I still have the single. I don't know what happened to the game. And further to this insanity, I found a game. I think I still have the record. I don't know if I still have the game because the box disintegrated. But K-Tel International, remember them? God, these guys are nuts. They hired some poor bastard. And I'll tell you what, my heart goes out to this guy. They invented a horse racing game. And you would bet on horses. What a great thing for kids, eh? Let's teach them how to gamble at the track. And you would play the record, and it was, let me think now. Was it 8 grooved or 12 grooved? Anyways, you would get one of, I think it was at least 8 different races. And you had no way of picking one or the other. And there was 2 sides. So I think it was 16 different races. So this is how you would play the game. You'd all bet on your horse, and then you'd play the record. And, as a game, it sort of didn't do much for me. But as a record, it completely fascinates me. So I still have that somewhere. Multi-cut records. There you go. Okay, February 1976. This one's kind of dumb and obvious, but the Eagles' Greatest Hits came out in February 76. This one's simple. It was the first record to go platinum. It was the first record to go multi-platinum. They invented multi-platinum, basically. It sold, 38 million copies. Best-selling record of all time. Thank David Geffen for this, I guess. It's the standard for sales that all the others kind of aspired to. And it changed once the record labels realized they could sell super platinum, they really went into hyperdrive. And it changed the way they signed bands. It changed how they did stuff. Music became much more homogenous. They were going for the hit, going for the hit, going for the hit. And the Eagles' Greatest Hits is very important LP record because of that simple fact that it just completely took off. And everybody wanted to be just like that. November 1979, this one's interesting. The Wall comes out by Pink Floyd. Now, The Wall was, first and foremost, highly anticipated. Everybody had been waiting, chomping at the bit for this record. It was rushed to completion, so much so that Richard Wright got fired because he wouldn't cancel his family holiday, apparently. So Roger just fired him. Had to rehire him, of course, to play the tour, because once the record came out, it was decided in Pink Floyd land that, you know what, this has got a song that would make a pretty good single. Now, Pink Floyd had sworn off singles since, I think, what was the single they gave up on? Point Me at the Sky, I think it was. They just said, fuck it. We're not going to make any more singles. And they never officially put out a single after Point Me at the Sky, which was what? 1968. Well, now it's 1979. And it is decided by their label, Columbia, and the powers that be, that they're going to put out another Brick in the Wall as a single. Then they book a tour of North America that I think only had 2 cities. I can't remember this. And there were 4 dates in LA. Now, this was a big deal. Oh boy, Pink Floyd's back. They've got a concept record. They're going to do a tour. God knows what kind of a crazy stuff they're going to bring with them. Yeah. And so they are prepared to take the world by storm. They send their single around to all the radio stations, of course, and they really concentrate on places like LA where they're going to play, but they concentrate everywhere. They just do the usual promo job, which shouldn't even really be necessary for this single because it's Pink Floyd's new single. Come on. And it's almost disco. Well, a funny thing happens. Nobody adds the song to their playlists. And Pink Floyd kind of goes, what? Well, it turns out that CBS has decided, and this is a long story that I'll try to make short. There was a thing called the network, and it was basically a mafioso kind of thing, where if you paid these slimy guys money, they could get your record played on the radio. It was payola, essentially, but they didn't want to, we don't like to use that word. And it was essentially legal, and it was getting freaking expensive. Record companies were spending, $100,000 per ad, which is a lot of dough. And it was decided in the corridors of power of CBS, I can't remember the fellow's name, Daly? He decided, no more of this. We're not going to pay these assholes. So they just told the network, no, we're not giving you anything. The Pink Floyd record will sell itself. Well, they couldn't get it on the radio, even though they had a gig in town. And so this was the first time the network they grappled with the network. If I remember correctly, they kind of retreated, and the network and I think a few of these network guys went to jail. But this was the kind of pimple. This was when the pimple burst with the network. And I think the network has sort of withdrawn a little bit. It's a little bit less insidious. It's probably still full of shit, but that was the first time it was revealed to be a problem within the industry, so much so it was costing them enough money that they tried to do it. So the Wall was important in that, I think. And then the last 2 are basically just sort of tide changers. April 1980, the band X put out their album Los Angeles on the very local Slash label in LA. And it's a pretty damn good album, and a lot of people agreed with me. And despite the fact that they were on a tiny independent label, and because of that, where they were going to get no attention whatsoever from anybody in the mainstream, the record really took off. Sold about 50 or 60,000 copies just in the LA area. And this was the first record that kind of made the major labels go, oh, it's punk rock, California hardcore, And this led to a lot of things happening. For instance, in the LA hardcore scene, MCA got involved with a label called Unicorn, and Unicorn had a band called Black Flag. Now, if you can imagine Black Flag being on MCA, often known as the Music Cemetery of America. There's a great thing where the president of MCA heard Damaged and kind of went, well, as a parent, I find this a very anti-parent record. And he said he didn't want to put it out. Well, that's another story. Black Flag ended up in court forever. But the major labels were looking at punk. And X were pretty punk rock. I mean, they had lots of rockabilly. They had Billy Zoom in the band, kind of rockabilly, but they were punk rock. And X did another record for Slash, which Slash kept it going with a couple of other bands. Next thing you know, Warner Brothers bought Slash, and Elektra signed X, and the rest is history. Everybody got rich, or well, I hope so anyway. Whoever started Slash, was it Claude Basie? One wonders how well they did out of it. And this leads me to the last one on my list, which is June 1989, and a little band on a little label called Sub Pop, called Nirvana, put out a record called Bleach. And Bleach was apparently recorded for $600 in 3 days by a guy named Jack Endino, who lives about, 4 hours that way. And he's very much like myself in those days, sort of a small-time local record producer who's got a studio. Come on in, $100 a day, whatever, bring lots of beer. And Nirvana came in, and they were pretty tight. Knocked out this record in no time. They'd been playing around. They'd put some singles out. Sub Pop was this local sort of little label out of Seattle. And they put it out, and it took off. And it took off because it's a great record. I really think it's a great record. I think it's probably their best record. It's very, very raw. I think it was recorded at 15 IPS on analog tape, which gives it that gritty, nice quality. And Cobain was a master of the gross guitar sounds. He had some good ones. And a lot of just like Negative Creep just defines the band, in my opinion. At any rate, the sound you heard following this record's success was the sound of heads hitting the ground after being chopped off in every A&R department of every major label. Because in every major label department, they went, why did you guys not know about these guys? Where did these guys come from? Oh, I don't know. They're just Seattle. I don't know, local band. And this was the beginning of the grunge revolution. And this sort of mirrored the British invasion in a way, because when the Beatles hit, suddenly every band from Britain was fair game for record labels. And then when punk hit, suddenly every band that was even remotely punk got picked up by major labels. I remember Pere Ubu got picked up by Chrysalis. That one just bends my mind. And so this was when Nirvana broke. Every grunge band in America started getting labels sniffing at them. And Nirvana, again, Sub Pop ended up thriving and ultimately being absorbed by Warner Brothers. Nirvana went on to Geffen. Poor old Kurt met his terrible end, which is really too bad because he seemed like a good dude. And I think he was getting better. And but this was the record where every major label really dropped the ball. I mean, just dropped the ball. And they learned. Of course, they overcompensated. What can I say? And there's a million stories. But that was the last LP record, I think, that I can think of. There might have been some more recent. But that really changed the way the industry worked. All of these changed the way the industry operated. And that's sort of why they're important in my estimation. There you have it. That's 12. God, that's a long one. I'm going to go look up Buddy Fight right now just to see what it's like. I hope it's good. I'll bet it's bloody terrible. Thanks for watching. And don't forget to subscribe, and I'll notify you when I come up with more silly stuff like this. Take care of each other, and we will talk to you soon.